everyone. Good morning. Assalamualaikum to our panelists and also to all the attendees. Thank you very much for joining us on this beautiful Friday morning. My name is Aira Azhari. I'm the manager of the Democracy and Governance Unit at IDEAS. So our webinar today is on race relations and human rights, bridging the gap. To kick off our ceremonies this morning, our IDEAS chairman and founding president, Tunku Zain Al-Abidin Ibni Tuanku Muhriz, has recorded a special welcoming message for all our guests and our panelists. Iskandar, over to you.
Good morning and assalamu alaikum. And I hope I can say that to both Muslims and non-Muslims, Malaysians and friends of all ethnic backgrounds and cultures. So often, the spiral of distrust of the other, someone not of your race or religion, stems from a seed of suspicion. Unfortunately today, all around the world, such suspicion is being deliberately stirred up by agitators, often with a political goal in mind, as per the maxim of divide and rule. Furthermore, echo chambers on social media can reinforce distrust and lead to deeply destructive and violent outcomes. Here in Malaysia, all of us know, even if we don't openly acknowledge it, that the effect of being of a certain race, or rather appearing to be of a certain race, can be very serious when it comes to receiving services, accessing educational opportunities, or getting a job. Yet it's always been a stated objective of the government to achieve unity among the diverse peoples of Malaysia. Our national motto is unity is strength, and many landmark policies and initiatives have been conceived to achieve this, the latest being the government's national unity policy launched last month. Whether it will result in any concrete change, time will tell. But judging from the responses, there's clearly much skepticism. Often it is down to communities, NGOs, and the private sector, which better exhibit better models of good race relations, and I'm proud that IDEA's National Unity Youth Fellowship in the past had a really strong impact on participants. Unfortunately, human rights is one of those terms that has become weaponized, affixed to all manner of other assumptions. The reality is that the fundamental concepts of what rights human beings should have overlaps across religions and cultures and has a surprisingly long history here as well. Centuries before our federal constitution spoke about fundamental liberties, law codes in Malay sultanates spoke about limiting the absolute power of rulers, decentralizing decision-making, and, in the case of the Undang-Undang Malaya, strongly protecting property rights. Events like today's are very important in continuing this tradition, and I congratulate Aira and the Democracy and Governance Unit at IDEAS for pursuing this important work. Thank you to Professor Dato Dr. Aishah Bidin and Dr. Khoo, Ying, Hooi for speaking today, and to the European Union for supporting us too. With that, thank you, and have a wonderful seminar ahead.
Thank you very much, Tunku Abidin. Very timely words, as always by him. And our webinar today is actually part of IDEA's latest campaign to promote national unity and interracial harmony in Malaysia. This Sunday, the 21st of March, in conjunction with the International Day of the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, IDEAS will launch Kita Bukan Kami, a media campaign to promote equality and inclusivity through the art of empathetic conversations. The main part of this campaign is a unique social experiment video series called Sama Sama, produced by us together with our partners, Impact Media Experts, the Fourth. The series aims to promote and model empathetic conversations as an alternative to the toxic screaming matches often seen in conversations about divisive issues today. In anticipation of the launch, we are screening an exclusive clip from the first video for our audience today. Iskandar, over to you.
my general fear, language requirement then is used to masquerade racist tendencies.
I totally disagree with that because language has nothing to do with race.
I don't think race and language should be a main criteria towards any job applications, or even if you want to seek for tenancy untuk rumah sewa, I don't think that should be a main criteria for you to look for a candidate. Mendengar secara berempati, berkongsi dengan ikhlas, menerima pendapat orang lain dengan terbuka.
Thank you. So that was just a short teaser of the campaign that we will launch this Sunday. So don't forget to follow Ideas on all our social media accounts, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and also the project-specific social media accounts on Instagram and also Facebook, which my colleague Iskandar will share in the chat box, the links with all of you. And do tune in to the launch of our campaign this Sunday. And now I think we can get right into our panel discussion. Our first panelist for this morning is Dr. Hooi. She is the head and senior lecturer of the Department of International and Strategic Studies of the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Malaya. Dr. Hooi, I will give you the floor. You have 20 minutes. Please go ahead.
Morning, and thank you very much, Aira. So today I'll be talking more on the race relations in connections with the human rights education. So in a multi-ethnic and multicultural society like Malaysia, we often talk about the connections between the race and education. And in the context such as how can our educational syllabus include a component of racial unity, or we commonly call it national unity as well, or how can we come up with more programs that will aim at fostering the unity among our multiracial populations. So if you recall, in 2017, the Unity Management Division in a written reply to one of the Member of Parliament about whether we will be introducing any anti-racism or anti-discrimination act. The reply was that the department has several measures that already being put in place to instill unity and a sense of Malaysian identity. For examples, the people will be encouraged to hold firm to the federal constitutions and the 5 points of our Rukun Negara. And the people are also encouraged to learn more about other races at their workplaces, home, learning institutions, and other places as well. So, and the other measures that are being put in place is that in the reply mentioned that the people can also play a role by telling politicians and others in the communities not to politicize matters pertaining to religions or ethnicities. So all of these measures are with one aim, that is, to prevent targeted remarks which could harm the religious and racial harmony of the country. So when we look at all these measures, it is very similar with what the National Unity Plan that has been launched, and there's really nothing too new about it. But my presentation today is to identify what is really missing or neglected is that we hardly make the relations between race relations and the human rights education. So in the discussions today, it seems only appropriate for us to ask how far we have come on the matters of race and how much further do we have to go. So anything to do with race is a constant debate here in Malaysia. For instance, the issues of vernacular schools, where some have attempted to call it as unconstitutional. But I think it will be more productive to focus on what can be the alternative approach for us to eliminate racial discriminations, where the argument against the vernacular schools has been used as a weapon for political gain for as long as I can remember. But with the Malaysian schools often being weaponized, and the syllabus and the curriculums that constantly changing to suit different religious and racial agenda, there's no doubt that, until today, we're still talking about national unity, racial unities, and so forth. So in these presentations, I would like to touch on two key points. First is the gaps in the race relations and human rights education in Malaysia, how it can how it contributes to the racial stereotypes, and the importance of the human rights education, especially at an early age. This also includes the importance of the literacy to our federal constitution. And second point that is very closely linked to the first part of it will be the question of, is the concept of human rights really Western? So the issues of human rights in Malaysia has been an ongoing debates and burning topics involving various stakeholders. The progress in addressing the human rights concern here in Malaysia is a product of decades of struggles for human dignity by Malaysians individually and collectively. If we observe the pervasive awareness within the society on human rights has been more sharply felt since the late 1970s, when we see the sharp increase of the human rights related NGOs. So the rights of Malaysians to participate in civil society and protection of basic civil liberties are spelled out at length under the second part of the federal constitutions, under the sections of fundamental liberties. But virtually, we know all of these freedoms are very often qualified by an overriding right of the government to decide otherwise if it wishes, in the interest of, for example, national interest or public order. So it is also equally important to mention about the democracy practice in Malaysia, as it is closely linked with how the human rights practice is implemented in the country. For decades, democracy in Malaysia is a contested term. The multi-ethnic nature of the Malaysian populations and the tendency of every political issue to be transformed into communalism has is a significant feature in socio-political context of Malaysia. So until today, as we see, the formulations of ethnically based parties that has continued to shape the Malaysian politics until today. So in a broader context, many ambiguities in the actual practice of the idea of democracy emerge. For example, there's a lot of analysis on Malaysian politics that found the tendency of the usage of ethnic conflict and identity as explaining the major political outcomes as troubling. So with such a background, one of the major challenges about ways to develop an integrated society through the inclusive national education policy in ensuring the equitable access to education in the country. So if we look at our Malaysia's national education policy, it is based on the national philosophy of education as expressed through the Education Act 1996, where it mentioned education in Malaysia is an ongoing effort towards further developing the potential of individuals in a holistic and integrated manner so as to produce individuals who are intellectually, spiritually, emotionally, and physically balanced and harmonious based on a firm belief in and devotions to God. Such an effort is basically designed to produce Malaysian citizens who are not only knowledgeable and competent, but also who are able to responsible and capable of achieving a high level of personal well-being, as well as being contribute to the betterment of the family, the society, and the nation at large together. So the central legislative provision that governs the system of education is, of course, as we see, provided in the federal constitution as well. And the other point that I would like to point out is the new economic policy back then has played an important role in bringing the changes to the national education system to manage. It is not only on the concerns of the economic imbalances, but also to ensure the unity. This included, if you notice, the introductions of the civic education as a subject following to that. So education reforms begins in the late 1980s and the 1990s with the passing of various legislations in 1996. So there are many factors, of course, globalizations, liberalizations, and as well as the robust economic growth. So based on such political foundations that we have, human rights education in the country has taken shape in different contexts to many Malaysians, human rights are considered as Western values, and it is contradict with the Asian values, although the terminology of Asian value is no longer that popularly being debated. Rather, there's a lot of other debates saying about cultural relativism and so forth. But as we remember, that terminology was popularized by Dr. Mahathir and the late president of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, in the 1990s, when the Vienna Declaration 1993 came into place in recognizing the human rights universally around the world. Moreover, in the context of Malaysia, religious values play a significant role in shaping the perceptions of the human rights in Malaysia. So from the human rights philosophical debate point of view, Malaysia is caught between the debate of universalism and the cultural relativisms, and the component of that cultural relativism in Malaysia is strongly based on the religious values, as mentioned, regarding the political systems of Malaysia that put emphasis on communalism, and moreover with the ethnic-based political parties. So there are a few documents that become the basic guiding principles in Malaysia. And for example, if you look at the Federal Constitution, Rukun Negara, and the National Philosophy of Education, they basically provide the basic guiding principle for a faith-based values education. So for instance, the first principle of the Rukun Negara, which is belief in God, emphasizes that God has created human beings of different races, different values and system. But what is important is that they may know each other and live in harmony. But this first principle then highlights the need for the human beings to respect each other's customs, values, and the belief systems. So based on such a background with different races, religions, value, and systems, the steps were taken by the government of Malaysia at that time was to foster the faith-based values and the moral education at all levels of education in the school. So if we look at the 1979 Cabinet Committee report, it states specifically in details about the faith-based moral and value education that has to link with, to ensuring the racial unity and to avoid the racial discriminations that is being practiced in Malaysia. So our quote, I say, to build a disciplined, cultured, and united society, it is recommended that while Muslim students study the Islamic religious knowledge, and this includes other students who choose to follow this subject, non-Muslims students should be taught moral and ethics education. So they must take it as well in the examination. So in both these subjects, respect for individual freedom to embrace any religion in a multi-religious society must be cultivated. But what has gone wrong really with all the education systems that, which we have, we introduce civic education, but in many instances that we see it comes and goes. And under the national curriculum that was first introduced back then in the primary and secondary schools between 1983 and 1989, we see that the teaching of the values and moral education are aimed at more of to understanding and strengthening the moral attitudes about the norms and the values of the society, and use them as a basis for decision making in everyday life. So civic education started in the early 1960s and took a strong foundations, especially after the 13 May racial riot in 1969. So civics and citizenship education was later on introduced in 2005 as a specific school subject, which allows some elements of human rights to be introduced in that subject itself. However, the civic educations, as you go through the syllabus, it does not systemically teach human rights concepts such as human dignity, right to life, civil and political rights, nor directly teach the universal declarations of human rights. So instead, what it emphasizes is really on national unity, voluntarism, and government structure, which has certain linkage to concept of human rights, but rather the foundations of what is human rights is missing. So there's also many other initiatives to actually introduce human rights education, and this is especially from SUHAKAN itself, came after the ratifications of the Convention of the Rights of the Children on 17 February 1995. But of course, that CRC itself is one of the foundations that, you know, can build a stronger foundation of why we should move forward for the human rights educations. So in the Malaysia Education Blueprint 2013 to 2025, the civic and citizenship education is removed as a distinct subject, and decided that the blueprint itself decided to incorporate it into several different subjects, such as Islamic education, moral education, history, and so forth. But however, challenges and complexities arise if human rights education were to introduce differently with a different terminology, by saying it just norms, values, morals in a multiracial country like Malaysia. So if you recall, during the administrations of Pakatan Harapan, civic education is reintroduced and being implemented in school in an they will hope to have a more integrated manner to actually cover the literacy and the practical aspects of the subjects. But I think that particular initiative did not really take off that well. And of course, as we know, due to the political situations, things which often impact on the policy, how it is being implemented. So the other things that I would like to also highlight is that the former education minister at that time said that the civic education is aimed at teaching citizens to know their rights, responsibility, and the moral values. And at the same time as well, during the change of governments, we also heard the announcements of the back then the Ministry of Foreign Affairs that Malaysia is committed to actually sign and ratify the remaining 6 international human rights treaties. And of course, that including, as we all remember, the controversies, debates surrounding the ICERT that the government has announced. And after that, we witnessed the protests that people were going against. Why should we sign and ratify ICERT, which is contradict to our federal constitutions? But all of these controversies contributes to the lack of understanding and awareness of what is human rights, really, because in general, Malaysians are not really exposed to any form of human rights educations. So how can the human rights educations address and eradicate racism? So one of the point is that if you look at the implementations and the policies that govern the civic educations, what they are doing is they're using the integrated method, where human rights teaching were integrated into the existing subjects like language, bahasa, or English, and so forth. However, I argue that such integration method does not equal to human rights education per se, due to the differences in teaching methods, and moreover, the existing faith-based education is already inherently not the same with the human rights education. As we know, there are many debates on even the concept of human rights itself. So human rights teaching was not introduced as a separate subject in the school, but it is to a certain extent exists in some tertiary institution, but limited. So, but if we have human rights educations that actually teach on more going to the foundations of it, of what is human rights, it really is, and how it is interlinked with our federal constitutions and our society that is heterogeneous. I think through that kind of understanding, I think, and not through only the huge investments in campaigns and things like that, then perhaps we can provide alternative approach in addressing the issues of racial discriminations. Also, raising awareness of human rights, of course, is not easy and complicated in Malaysia due to the lack of human rights practice in many phases of the development. And moving forward, I think human rights educations, if it could be become part of the school curriculum, not as a subject, but for it to be actually integrated, I think there is a need to actually look at the pedagogy methods and things like that. Yeah. And today, against the backdrop of the COVID-19 pandemic that we see, there's a huge socio-economic inequalities, and that exacerbated the hate speech, and the world is also basically witnessing a global uprising against systemic, institutionalized and structural racism and discriminations. So what we see is the systemic racism and discriminations are rooted in the structures of society itself, governments, workplace, education institutions, and so forth. So we need to also see racism as a violations of the UDHR, which all the countries are subscribed under the UN Charter. And it goes against the UNESCO's conventions against discrimination in education, the ICERT, the International Covenants on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, CRC, and many others. So education systems and educational institutions have an important role and responsibility in addressing and eliminating racism through different ways. For instance, of course, if we were talking about human rights educations, I think training of the teachers are needed. If we look at the human rights education in school report from SUHAKAN, it has revealed all the structural problems that we have in terms of capacity building, the knowledge on the human rights itself in terms of before they actually implement in the schools, and to ensure of the optimum outcomes of it. And the other point that I would like to help up is that examine the curriculums from multiple different points is also necessary, where the school should give history, social memory, and human rights, as well as all those indigenous forms of the knowledge as one of the foundations and at the core of the teaching. And this could hopefully help us to fully understand the past and its relations to the present, and trying to break these perpetuations of the stereotypes. And second, I think the revisions of the curriculum is always ongoing. However, the process of it, perhaps we need to include more stakeholders, and especially on the human rights scholars, human rights practitioners, and the textbooks in particularly that needs re-examinations to eliminate racist misrepresentations and historical exclusions as well. So with all those points, I think human rights educations, whether it can help to foster the race relations by replacing what we have currently with the moral educations, Islamic education, and so forth. And bottom line is that to reduce the multi-ethnic debates and the conflicts is by bringing together individuals from different backgrounds, as we know. I think those are basically all the campaigns that we aim is to bring everybody together on the same ground, that from different cultures, and that hopefully this can eliminate the race discrimination, because I think one of the key factors that we continue to see the conflicts between the different ethnic groups is basically due to the lack of knowledge or of other ethnic groups, and also the lack of opportunities for such an info, because we have different types of school education systems and so forth, and background. So therefore, I think one of the effective ways to reduce this racial discrimination is to encourage continuous interactions among the individuals of various races, then hopefully to lead to a more positive and tolerant attitudes among the people themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ying Hooi. Very, very interesting viewpoints that I think we can pick up after the discussion, the panel discussion is over. To our audience today, if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box, and I will read them out during our Q&A session in a bit. Yeah. Okay, so our second speaker for today is Professor Dato Dr. Aishah Bidin. So she is a professor of corporate and insolvency law at the Academy of Sciences, Malaysia, and she is also a former commissioner at the Human Rights Commission of Malaysia, SUHAKAN. Please, Prof. Aishah, the floor is yours. You have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Aira, for giving me this opportunity to speak on some issues relating to race relation. My concern is about the time, actually, about 20 minutes, but I'll try to perhaps highlight some of the issues relating to discrimination, non-discrimination. So what I will actually highlight on during this brief presentation, one is I'm going to link that with ICERT, of course, some issues relating to ICERT, and I'll then go into discrimination at workplace, what perhaps is the status and position within the context of business and human rights, the United Nations Guiding Principle on Human Rights. Number three, I'm going to also look into some aspect in terms of gender issues, discrimination, especially in terms of gender discrimination as well, covering some of the work by SUHAKAN when I was formerly a commissioner there, and some cases that we have actually came across in terms of discrimination. I'm also going to touch upon the marginalized group, especially in terms of anti-migrant sentiments, especially at the effect, due to the effect of COVID-19. And then I'm going to make some recommendation as to how we go forward. Now, the first part is on ICERT. Now, Malaysia within this context made such historical impact, made such an impact because out of the 197 countries, 179 has acceded, either has acceded or ratified. Only 14 countries have not done that. And Malaysia is one of them, right? The other one is within the ASEAN region. Malaysia is also one of the 3 countries in ASEAN that has not acceded or ratified. Others include Brunei and Myanmar for that particular matter, right? So there are, of course, certain issues relating to that. I think the main issue is why have not the government made any initiative or to accede or to ratify ICERT? I think Dr. Khoo has mentioned just now at one stage, there was an initiative there, right, to sign it, but then later it was actually then revoked. But I would just like also to mention that although the term relating to racial discrimination is actually defined in ICERT, which includes actually any distinction, exclusion, restriction, or preference based on race, color, descent, or national or ethnic origin, which has the purpose or effect of nullifying or impairing the recognition, enjoyment, or exercise on an equal footing of human rights and fundamental freedoms, either in the political, economic, social, cultural, or any other field of public life. Now, ICERT is not the first convention that talks about racial discrimination, because there are also other international human rights convention that has already mentioned this. This is clearly, I think, mentioned also in CEDAW, a convention that we have also ratified and acceded by Malaysia, and of course CRPD, relating to disability, UDHR, and also ICCPR. So there are actually the mention of elimination of forms of discrimination, and racial discrimination is one of it. But perhaps maybe due to the lack of understanding of this concept of racial discrimination, I think the public is also not aware regarding there are situations where exceptions are given, which are called affirmative action. And this is also clearly provided by ICERT Article 1.1.4, in which it provides that special measures are taken for the sole purpose of securing adequate advancement of certain race or ethnic groups or individuals requiring such protection as may be necessary in order to ensure such groups or individuals equal treatment or exercise of human rights and fundamental freedom shall not be deemed as racial discrimination. So there is actually a provision that allows in some situation where where it is not considered as racial discrimination, that there is some kind of what you call protection given to certain groups. And I think that part perhaps is not made clearly, that perhaps maybe the lack of a clear understanding what ICERT is all about, that give rise to this unacceptable ordering or unacceptance of ICERT. And again, the fact that we have actually acceded and ratified CEDAW. CEDAW also contained provision relating to affirmative action. For instance, Article 4, relating to special measures aimed at accelerating equality between men and women shall not be considered as discrimination. So that's also something that we have actually adopted. In addition to that, Article 5.4 of CRPD, which talks about specific necessary measures to accelerate or achieve de facto equality of persons with disability, shall not be considered as discrimination again. So I think the Human Rights Convention actually allows, in some circumstances, some space, some measures being given to some groups for that particular matter. Now, back in Malaysia, of course, we have different laws, the federal constitution and the different laws provided that actually allows for equality, allows for some form of treatment. Now, as far as the federal constitution is concerned, I think it's very important. Article 8 forms the cornerstone of the constitutional protection relating to rights to equality and non-discrimination. And of course, Article 12 relating to protection from discrimination in relation to certain protected grounds in the on the grounds of area of education. In addition to that, as far as services and state employment, when it comes to impartial treatment of federal employees, there is also Article 136. So there are provisions in the law which provides for non-discrimination as well. And also, of course, we are aware there are also provisions that give for special privileges and treatment. Yeah, and that one, I think we are clearly aware for that particular issue. Now, on another note, sometimes where situations of non-discrimination or some situations of discrimination arise, sometimes it happens within the realm of private laws, like in contracts, you know, a contracts between employer and employee, a contracts in business, for instance, a contract appointing migrant workers or foreign workers, a contract of hiring of contractors and so forth. These are sometimes governed by private laws. Now, Malaysia does not have the Unequal Contract Terms Act 1977 as in UK, which actually applies to businesses, you know, which actually stress on the point of elimination or non-discrimination. But Malaysia does not have that particular provision in laws. So I think where the gaps are, where there are gaps in hard law, then that should be filled by the concern and protection in the soft law such as the international convention like ICERT, ICCPR, UDHR, CEDAW, and CRPD, and so forth. So that's the part in which we are missing here. Of course, the proposal would be to go forward in terms of providing initiative to proceed efforts in understanding ICERT first. Yeah, so that's particular matter. Now, next, I'm going to actually discuss something relating to discriminatory practices at workplace. Right. When you talk about workplace, there are situations where discrimination can happen. For instance, refusal to hire due to racial preferences. The question is whether this is justifiable. There are, of course, studies being conducted to say that, to say that there are evidence that there are forms of discrimination in terms of hiring and appointment. For instance, some jobs may require certain interest and skill of certain language to certain groups. But again, this is actually a private matter. Then because we do not have certain laws which regulate something like unfair contract terms, like in 1977 in UK, then this practice will actually continue. But of course, this is something that needs to be cautious again, right? Because the domain of private laws are between the consensus between the individuals that are involved, unless the contract was entered by virtue of duress, force, mistake, whatsoever. So that will become an avoidable contract, which they are open to remedy. So I think in that sense, there are what you call there are forms of discrimination, and this is the part in which I think the context of, or the concept of business and human right is relevant. It's very relevant and can be applied here. Now, within the context of business and human right, it actually allows the duty of the state to actually to protect human rights, to protect the public from violation of business and human rights, and of course for the corporate, for employers, to respect human rights and to provide remedies when there is a form of violation. So I think in this sense, I think we need to make sure that although there are no specific provisions in the law that express about this in terms of business and human rights, but that gap and lacuna is actually filled in by the United Nations Guiding Principle via its 3 pillars, in which non-discrimination is also considered to be part, is considered to be part of it, because as far as the practice implementation of UNGP, it is to be implemented irrespective of the size of the companies, irrespective of the geographical location, and of course, irrespective of any forms of discrimination, gender, race, and so forth. So there is a link there in terms of business and human rights. Next, the issue relating to rental market discrimination, because this came out, I think, in the press, and there was particularly an issue relating to discrimination by landlords, which actually initiate and actually drive the government to come up with drafting the Residential Tenancy Act. That is actually a very adequate and a strategic proposal, I think, in that sense. And because there is no clearly provisions in the law that protect tenants against forms of racial discrimination against the landlord. And what is present, I think, are the soft laws. Article 10 of the Code of Conduct of the Malaysian Institute of Estate Agents actually provides that all agents are morally and ethically bound by law to treat all parties equally and not to discriminate any person for reason of race, color, religion, sex, handicap, family status, sexual origin, or gender identity. So I think we do have the kind of protections in the code, but not in the law. So I think in this sense, this is a very effective and timely proposal, suggestion by the government to come forward with this act, with this particular draft of the residential tenancy draft. In addition to that, there, of course, as far as the gender issues, certainly there are already decided cases that they have actually debated in terms of discrimination against women. And of course, there are provisions under Article 11 and Article 13 of CEDAW which actually protects women, and of course, elimination of discrimination against women. We also have case laws in Malaysia that actually has dealt with this matter, especially the case of Nur Fadila binti Ahmad Salikin, relating to a Guru Sandaran, a temporary teacher that was actually being terminated in terms of its employment due to the fact that she was pregnant at that time. This is a private contract, of course. So when you talk about a private contract, again, the question is, now she accepted at the time where she enters the particular contract. That's where I think, because if we do not have the resolution in the Act, then of course, the way to resolve is to actually to look into the international convention for that particular matter. There are, of course, the other cases as well, for instance, in terms of the Air Asia and Rafiza case here, in terms of also a case of a termination of employment as well. I've also come across, I think, relating to the, especially in terms of appointment and hiring of transgender issue. It just happened at that time when that study was made back in 2019, when I was formerly a commissioner. The essence was in terms of discrimination against transgender. And it does happen. We actually have managed to identify some cases in terms of hiring and appointment of transgender, rejection of them on certain job and so forth. But looking back again, sometimes these are also isolated case, and it just happened that it might also become a race issue. But of course, at that point of time, it's very much on the gender issues. SUHAKAN also has been very active in terms of advocacy work relating to discrimination, non-discrimination, relating to CEDAW, and of course the various provisions in terms of the amendments on the Employment Act and so forth. Now, the other aspect which I'm going to speak about is, of course, the anti-migrant sentiment, relation to foreign workers, migrant workers, refugees, and asylum seekers. Unfortunately, Malaysia has not acceded or ratified any of the conventions relating to this marginalized group. In fact, refugees are considered as having no legal status in Malaysia, right? And but the fact that because of the situation, the complaints and the issues relating to at workplace, and especially the impact of the foreign and migrant workers, we can observe that this is a form of discrimination against foreign and migrant workers as well. Now in Malaysia, the official data from the Immigration Department, Ministry of Home Affairs, shows that there's about 1.98 million migrant workers that were employed in Malaysia by September 2019. There are, of course, evidence to indicate in terms of deplorable situations, poor living conditions of the foreign workers and so forth. I think if you were to go through the SUHAKAN report and of course other reports written by other internet association as well. But what I think is the main concern is the effect of COVID-19 onto this particular marginalized group. Yeah, they are very much in a situation where, due to the evidence of poor working condition, accommodation, unsanitary condition, and so forth, it becomes, a catalyst to spread the COVID-19 effect to these workers. And in fact, we were informed that there are many clusters of COVID-19 which originated from foreign and migrant workers. So there are also statements and sources which indicate the MCO actually makes it worse situations at the detention centers, where the immigration detention centers become COVID-19 hotspot because there's no adequate or appropriate SOP being carried out, and of course due to the effect of poor SOP, then referring to the obligation negligence of employer and so forth. So these are very clear implications of COVID-19 towards foreign and migrant workers as well. Of course, we do hope that there will be more initiative and efforts done by the government in terms of protection to this particular group. Now, looking forward, again, as I said, these issues on race relations and lack of understanding originate because of not being able to understand the whole concept of racial discrimination, because the International Convention, as I mentioned just now, various of them also provide provision on positive affirmative action as well. So I think the way to go forward, of course, would be on the awareness, for the public on the ICERT, of explaining to them in very simple terms, because the provisions of the convention sometimes can be very technical in international human rights language and not fully understood by the common people. Number two, of course, there should be more public engagement and consultation to act as platforms where people can actually express their ideas, their concerns, and so forth. There's always been talks about the lacuna in the law, because we have some provisions in the Employment Act, the immigration laws and so forth, which provide some forms of discrimination on certain groups. So these terms of reviewing the law, more effective more effective enforcement will always cropped up. And I think this is something initiative that must be taken into consideration over and over again. And finally, of course, as I mentioned to you, what is basically very, very important is the political will. At the end of the day, it falls back to the political will of whether you want to go forward, you want to accede, or ratify, or sign. It goes back again to the duty of the state to protect all these forms of violations against racial discrimination. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Dato Dr. Aishah. I think that was very, very enlightening, and I learned a lot indeed, especially quite interested in your remarks on the private law discrimination. And I think this is interesting. In fact, we have a question actually from the audience exactly about this. So some questions have started trickling in. What I will do is I will take one question for each speaker, and then I will give you some time to answer it, and then we will move on to the next questions. Yeah. Okay, so the first question is from, there's a question from Andrew Khoo for Prof. Aishah. So I'll just read it out here. Andrew asks, should the separation between public and private law be abolished or reformed in some way? Why should private contracts be free to violate the fundamental liberties enshrined under the Federal Constitution? And what will it take to bring this about? So Prof. Aishah, please go ahead.
Yes, I think this is quite a troublesome issue actually, to separate private and the public domain, of course, is something very challenging and very difficult, because we have the different types of law. And there are, of course, terms, rights, and obligations that govern each heading of the law. But I have to say that there are already some countries, like Singapore, already have adopted the Unfair Contract Terms Act. UK, for instance, then of course they made amendment to the Unfair Contract Terms Act, only limited to business transactions and not to consumer transactions. So I think as far as the individuals actually agree to the terms of the contract, then this will actually prolong. So going back to the question of Mr. Andrew just now, of course, to separate between, to demarcate between both private and public law is difficult, because each domain serves its purpose. Each domain has its own purpose and has its own what you call stakeholder to serve, because it's a public and private. But I think issues relating to racial discrimination, issues relating to social justice, issues relating to the right to express freedom and racial discrimination as well, is a universal concept, right? So a universal concept can actually be integrated in a private transaction, right? So I think that's the part in which we, that can be done, I think. We can actually propose in terms of how does this private dealings be conducted? Yeah, and of course that would be the area, if it's a business and commercial or foreign transaction, there will be, of course, the business and human right aspect in which they can apply some of the concepts. In fact, for foreign and trade investment, UNCTAD has already come up with a list of terms and proposal relating, incorporating the UNGP guiding principle in terms of foreign and trade investment and so forth. So I have to say that, one, I think the looking at it, not all issues relating to discrimination can be resolved by hard law. That's the reason why we have this soft law to come in and to fill in those gaps and lacuna. And when it comes to the private domain, because there are gaps in the black letter law, that's where I think the soft law should come in. And a universal principle should be adopted in that sense: equality, social justice, and so forth. Again, as I make some example in terms of the Residential Tenancy Act just now, because of the association, of estate agents, have actually accepted that this is actually a form of code, but they have accepted that to be incorporated in terms of between landlord and tenants. So that will be my response for that particular question.
Thank you so much, Prof. Aishah. The next question, we have one for Dr. Ying. So this is from Hooi. It's in the chat box. So I'll just read it out. MOE should prioritize DLP schools to encourage students from different ethnic backgrounds to mingle from a young age to minimize racial discrimination and promote national unity. The segregation of students following the gradual replacement of English as the medium of instruction after May 13 in our national schools has reduced racial understanding and promoted racial polarization. So it's not exactly a question, but I think Ying, you can give some comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Aira, and thank you, Chai, for the comment as well. I will not particularly think that just with the dual language programs will be effective, and by using to say that to use English as a medium of instructions will be effectively reduce the racial discriminations. I'm more of thinking the national language should come first. And I think despite of whichever different school systems that we have, national schools, vernacular schools, but in different components of it, the Bahasa itself needs to be there. But I think what it reveals is more of our policy implementations issues that we have. And for instance, even until today, we are still having the thought of are we calling it is a Bahasa Melayu or it is a Bahasa Malaysia, that kind of things, and different stakeholders have different way of interpreting how we should term it. And I think dual language program itself in a multiracial country might not be only answer. and it might not do that effective in the long run. So I think policy changes in terms of the delivery and how we implement the policies that has been drafted, as well as I must emphasize that the lack of training to the teachers in terms of, whenever we introduce something new is very crucial, because very often I think the government say that, we revise the curriculum and then we wanted to do this and that, but we have to really go back to our own teachers and staff to see, are they actually already being given adequate form of capacity building before they carry out something and channel it to the schools. And I think that is something that we should look into. Yeah.
Thank you, Ying Hooi. Actually, I have a follow-up question to that. So you mentioned about how the national language policy, we can't decide whether it's Bahasa Melayu or Bahasa Malaysia. There's been some changes as well, right, over the years. I'm wondering if maybe you could add your comments on how this uncertainty about the national language, does it speak to a larger, say a larger issue of mistrust, I would say, maybe among different ethnicities in Malaysia, and that which leads to probably like a lack of ownership of the national language, do you think?
Well, I think, of course, there are different factors contributing to the kind of society that we have. But if we're looking at it from the perspective of the diversities that we have here, and to embrace the diversity that we have, and I think that can provide a little bit positive lights that at the community level, normally when we can't communicate, when we come from different ethnicities, we tend to use Bahasa, for instance, to overcome that, or sometimes use English to overcome that. And I think, of course, I must say that in these questions about the national language, of course, I think national language is very important. And very often we all often see that, this is Bahasa Melayu Week, and then everybody should speak on that. And I don't think after 6 decades of independence, and we are still talking about the language things. And that is precisely why I think in my presentations that I mentioned, the understanding of how our country is being formed, and by having all the knowledges of our histories and things is very important to contribute to how we actually think the directions that we should go in terms of racial unity. Because I think every day we are hearing the same things about the campaigns about national unities. And of course, back then in the administrations of Najib Tun Razak, we heard of One Malaysia slogan. So it is basically, in the end, it is for the same thing and same ingredients, but why are we still debating it? And I really think it is lack of knowledge about different ethnicities of our differences. And I think it is beautiful to see differences, and then how we can embrace each other and become one, because it's a give and take and tolerance society, as we always mention.
Thank you. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Beautiful to see the differences, and we're actually really blessed to have this diversity in Malaysia, and I think many other countries envy us for that. Actually, there's quite an interesting sharing here in the chat box as well by Kot Liang Chew. I will just take the gist of his sharing. So basically, he is, I think the gist of it is whether a Race Relations Act in Malaysia is something that is required, or and I think there has been discussions on the part of the government to have some sort of National Harmony Act. So maybe Prof. Aishah, maybe you could lend some comments on this.
Yes, I recall there were consultations which were hosted by SUHAKAN in terms of getting feedbacks from the various stakeholders in terms of the National Unity Act and so forth, which I think is very sound. But again, I think the problem here, I think, is because the coherency between the different agencies, the different agencies. And of course, the political scenario at that time actually also take a turn in terms of the direction where the discussion was leading. But I recall there were quite a number of very positive and generate a lot of interest in terms of this particular act. And I think that would be in whatever, Aira, I just like to mention, in whatever kind of polemic, especially if it's a sensitive one, you need to have a platform to allow people to speak up and to give their ideas, because this platform will address those issues, those concerns that's hidden there. And I think that's what happened to some of, unfortunately, this is what happened to some of the initiative done by SUHAKAN before, because I think some of the lack of understanding of some issues. So any forms of initiative in terms of going or promoting towards racial unity, if the answer is by legislation, it must require that kind of acceptance or consultation by the relevant stakeholder. I think that's very important for people to understand. And what I think the public wants to know are the implications. Because not only what does it mean in terms of definition, but the implication to the groups, to the special rights, to certain groups, to marginalized groups. And then I think if we are not able to reach to that particular margin, I think there is always that concern of making it in a form of law. That's where I think I would come back to my proposal in the beginning, that not all of these issues or sentiments or forms of discrimination perhaps can be addressed by the law, because there are, I think, also constraints and limitations in law itself. So that's the reason why we have soft law. That's the reason why we have all these international human rights conventions for the states to address the issues. And I think that's something that that we need to understand first, right? Legislating a particular legislation is a good attempt, but the next question is, can it resolve the issue? If the issue is so much embedded in the system that has been sort of, being developed or originated through our forefathers and so forth. So that's the part in which I think how to look forward is the understanding and the awareness part. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Prof. Aishah. I think just as a reminder to our attendees today, when you type your message in the chat box, do choose panelists and attendees so that the other attendees can also read your messages. Yeah. Okay. So there's a question here in the Q&A from Mark Che. So he's asking, how do you explain that in the 50s and 60s, we had more racial integration than we have today? In those days, we mixed freely among races and we dined together and visited each other than festive seasons, but not now. So I think I will sort of summarize this question into asking our panelists to maybe share why, based on the research and the work that you've done, is there really a sort of negative trend in race relations in Malaysia, or is it just because we have more social media, we have our society is, I think, getting more informed and more the world is getting more connected, that societal divisions appear to be more serious than it is? Or is there actually evidence that there is this negative trend that is happening? Because I myself struggle with this question. Some people say that it's our education system that contributes to these divisions. Many people think it is politics. that contributes to this. I would like to hear from Dr. Ying Hooi first on about this issue of negative trend in race relations.
Okay, thank you, Aira, and thank you, Mark, for the questions. And I think rightly pointed out by Mark on the timeline itself in the 1950s and the 1960s. And as we know, after the 1969, the racial riots, things have changed, in our political landscapes. And anything to do with the race has become even more sensitive. And this is evidence in terms of, even when we look at the Aishah episode. So we are always being reminded that, we don't want to repeat the racial riot in 1969, or including any forms of the protest in the past, including the birthday protest. It is always seen that, the certain group championing this particular agenda. So the other group, so all these kind of things, although it is related to the future of the country, but it is always being bring together and trying to tie it up with different groups subscribes to different ideologies and so forth. So I think the other factors that contributed to this is that, as I just now mentioned in my presentations, education is being used and I must say as a weapon for different political parties in terms of championing their own political interests, because we have basically ethnically based political parties. So in order to win different votes from different ethnicities, and then education is one way for them to actually a platform that they very much actively use. And the other thing is that I think our society is very often more reactive, meaning whenever there's an incident, and then they will react on it, and then they will start all the controversies and discussions, but then for at some point without any solutions coming out, then we will move on to another issues and things. So that's the same thing with the educations, and different policies came out, and although we have blueprints that actually guide us, but very often if you look at what they need to implement in the blueprints or the plans, many things are not followed through because there's no a proper mechanism for us to actually check through what have the government actually done in terms of implementing such recommendations. And Aira just now mentioned about the social media. Of course, social media is one, and that is part of the globalizations that we live with. But I think perhaps the issues that we have is that when the technological advance that happening in the societies, and with all of us using social medias and things, did our education system actually moving into the same directions by having more changes in terms of our curriculum to actually accommodate the changes that we are currently experiencing, because those things needs to go in tandems. So I mean, of course, the curriculum reviews comes in a certain periods of time, but sometimes in a more specific incidents and things like that, I think there is a need to relook into whether our current policies can actually accommodate with the changes that we experience.
Thank you. Prof. Aishah, would you like to add some comments on this?
Yeah, I believe that with time passing by, with rapid development over technology, over globalization, and so forth, I think perceptions and knowledge of people will change. Yeah, and of course, in that sense, I think from the past, in terms of the increasement of knowledge and so forth, I think during those times, people do not very much would like to question very much in terms of certain issues, as compared to now, what you call the more modern generation, right? People start to, I mean, the manner in which we teach our students at university in terms of their analytical skill is to question. It is not only merely to accept things and so forth. And people become very critical of issues, of policies, which is a good sign actually, which actually is a good sign in terms of advancement of knowledge, advancement of technology. The fact that, you know, anything that can happen, or a tweet or a particular information can just be in seconds, be sort of be viral, and it will be, you know, everybody will get access to it. That can be interpreted negatively and positively, because negatively is if you just accept what you hear or what you read, that would be very dangerous. But if you actually evaluate and analyze and try to look at you know, in a different way, right, then that can lead to, you know, a very critical mind situation. So I have to say that because of the advancement of knowledge, people, I think the young generation, especially at the moment, they would start to be more critical of situation, of policies, of government policies and issues in that way. And I think which can be interpreted as a good way. But again, advancement of technology can also be interpreted negatively, right? If you believe totally what you read in the media, that's one. So I have to say that you know, there are quite a number of reasons when we start to compare in the 1560s and now in the new millennium. You know, we have new young generations who are really very critical of the surroundings, the environment, and so forth. But that is to be expected. That is to be expected as well. I think what is more important is if we realize that there's problems in terms of national integration, then what do we do to resolve it? How do we go about in trying to get that kind of environment that we have before? Because we have a breed of new generation who are very critical, you know, who are critical and who are aware of all these particular issues. So I have to say this certainly is going to happen now and in the future, where generations of generations will actually be more receptive, will be more proactive, and so forth.
Thank you, Prof. Actually, I do agree with your point of view, where, you know, increasing critical views about national unity, about race relations, is not necessarily a negative thing. In fact, technologies such as social media and so forth has, I think, democratized the space for discussions on unity and race relations. And as you said as well, it is inevitable as technology progresses. It is much easier for human beings to communicate with each other. And naturally, these discussions will take place more frequently, more publicly, and it's not necessarily a negative thing. And of course, we should have provisions to protect vulnerable groups, I think, from oppression, from discrimination. But it doesn't mean that we should not encourage critical discourse as well. So yeah, this is good. So there's a question here from Facebook, actually, which I will take. Yeah. So the question is there a national service that works to nurture perpaduan among the youth? And what model can we look to that would work for Malaysia? This is a good question. We did have a national service before. The effects of that are, I think, still up for debate. But I would open it to whichever panelist who would like to take this one. Dr. Ying, do you want to take this one on how to nurture perpaduan amongst youth and national service?
Yeah, thank you, Aira, and thank you for that questions. But I would just like to add on to the previous question just a little bit on, of course, the critical discourse about race relations and then speech. But I think we also have the issues with the legislations that actually impact on our freedom of speech. So I think with the laws that are not favored into the freedom of expressions, actually will impact on how we can move forward in terms of to have a more critical discourse when we talk about race, because then we have Sedition Act, then we have a few days ago, then we talk about fake news and things like that, you know. So those are the legislations that actually impact on how the society can move forward in terms of being critical on, let's say, for government policies and things. Yeah. So come back to the questions about that national service. As I just now mentioned, when we have different governments or different ministers, we tend to have different policies, and whether we should have a national service or not, I think there's a lot of impacts into it, and we need to see whether is it feasible policies that to be implemented in our country. But I would not think that national service alone is the answer in terms of to reduce the racial discriminations. After all, we have schools that should already play up that particular role, rather than you know, we must have another layer of national service just for that purpose itself. Yeah.
Okay, Iman, my take on the national service, I think the idea is noble. To have a national service, irregardless of race and color and religion, is a good thing. But what is also more important is how you implement it. You know, how you implement it, and how and what are the implications to the young generation, and what do they benefit from that. That would be more important. Just to carry out a particular kind of module is one thing, but the effectiveness is another, because national service perhaps is not only in Malaysia, you know, at one stage, because there are other countries, of course, we know nearby our neighbor Singapore conducted its national service, and we can see that, you know, how different is the situation is. But I have to say that any kind or initiative in terms of trying to provide national unity is, of course, something which is recommendable. But the thing is that how the operational aspect, how do you go about it? The curriculum contained in the service itself, how do you go, how that is being actually measured and evaluated and so forth. And of course, with I also believe that national service alone would not be sufficient, you know, but it will be one complementary, one factor that might actually also contribute to the efforts or to the agenda of providing national unity, because we can hear that this is nothing new. There are also other countries who have actually implemented national service. Perhaps maybe it's also it's high time to review and to relook back again in terms of the agenda, how to make it much more effective, because of course it's a very big program. Of course, there are financial implication, structural decision, and so forth. But just having service alone might not be sufficient, but perhaps to review and to incorporate the effectiveness of the service is also much more important. And we have done that in the past, and perhaps also a sort of a review of the service and a post-mortem actually of what are the shortcomings of the service would of course be ideal in order maybe to improve, you know, how do we go forward in that particular matter.
Thank you very much, Prof. Aishah. Yeah, I think the national service, our national service also, I think maybe part of the problem was probably it had mixed objectives. I think the national service, as you mentioned, in Singapore and I think in South Korea, has a very clear objective of military service, right? So the men who join, who it's compulsory for the men to join the national service because they are expected to defend the country when the time comes. So I think there is a bit of a mixed objective there, perhaps. There's another question here from Andrew for Ying Hui. So he asks, Article 152 of the Federal Constitution says the national language shall be the Malay language. Post-1969, we promoted the national language as Bahasa Jiwa Bangsa to encourage national unity and Bangsa Malaysia. We had Muhibah and our goal was a multiracial society. But now we accept that we are a plural society and everyone is just insisting on their literal black letter law rights for their respective communities. How do we move forward to recover a multiracial Malaysia?
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, for the questions. I'd like to answer this by suggesting that perhaps we need to have a relook into our history subject, which I was understood that our history subjects, we try to do away with the chronological order in terms of understanding our histories. But I think over the years and times, we often know that, history is very important, but for many young people, history is a subject that you need to just memorize it and then pass it in the exam. But however, I think history itself will teach how we overcome the differences that we have, and before we even talking about being one, in terms of perhaps to contribute by looking at the spirit of the federal constitutions, by looking at the Rukun Negaras and things in moving forward to recover multiracial Malaysia. Because before we even talk about all this national unity plan, we have already come across the discussions about our Rukun Negara as well, when the Prime Minister Tan Sri Muhyiddin was mentioning that we need to encourage people to understand the spirit of the Rukun Negara and things. But the thing is that we often come with the policies but by not really linking it all together, but by separating it. So I think when we talk about understanding the spirit of the federal constitutions or even the Rukun Negara, all of these elements have a very close link, and it shouldn't be separated based on different plans that we have. I think the problem occurs when we start separating it in a different campaigns for different purposes, where the two is very much closely linked together.
Thank you. Prof. Aishah, do you have any comments on this?
Well, I think this one I have to say in terms of consistency. My concern was, in terms of the position of the language. At one stage, in terms of this, one is the usage of the English language, and then the usage of the Malay language, and we observe that there is a change throughout the years. I think that also calls for another word, confusion, confusion between, especially in terms of the educators and so forth. I believe to a certain extent what Dr. Khoo mentioned, we need to look again at our Rukun Negara and also our historical values, what we have taught them at that particular time. And we do need to be consistent in terms of the policy, because this change of policy between one language to the other and so forth sometimes also has resulted in a lot of confusion among the educators, what more among children as well, and parents as well, to mention about this thing. But I would not want to deal it in further detail, because I think Dr. Khoo has actually elaborated that lengthy.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Prof. So I think I will take this question from Naz Iskandar. It's a long one, but it's okay. I will just read it out. So Naz, he says he's writing his undergraduate dissertation in the UK on equality in Malaysia from the perspective of political philosophy. So he says that during his research, he came across work by political theorists such as Saila bin Habib that suggests that cultural boundaries and identities should be recognized as socially constructed and flexible, and that therefore these differences should not be overly refined. However, there is very little, if any, relevant discussion in this area of political theory on the Malaysian context. I find myself wondering if the panelists have any thoughts on this, especially considering the colonial roots of ethnic divisions in Malaysia. So I think I'll just summarize that. So Naz asks, what do the panelists think about cultural boundaries and identities being socially constructed and flexible? Is there discourse around this in Malaysia, especially considering our post-colonial the post-colonial nature of our country. So maybe Dr. Ying, would you want to take this one?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Nas, for the questions. Of course, I agree that when we talk about cultural boundaries and things like that, it should be flexible. And I think that is precisely why just now I mentioned that we should embrace the differences. You know, we shouldn't say that, you know, it has to be, of course, it has to be in the same mold, but the differences comes together before that we need to embrace before we become one. And I think Nas' questions reminded me to another discourse that we had, you know, that this is precisely the issues that, you know, we are so reactive to a certain incident, and after we discuss it, but we never bring, carry that particular discourse along and maybe to turns it into something that we can implement. So if you remember, during the Pakatan Harapan's administrations, there was mentioning of, you know, why are we not teaching philosophy, political philosophy in the schools or in the university themselves, because philosophy itself is important in terms of teaching the young people to understanding a little bit more about before they understand how dynamic our political landscape is about. Because if you cutting across, you look at our universities, that subject itself, political philosophy, is lacking. And I think back then, what happened with Dr. Mazli was that he introduced 3 different subjects to replace what we have in the university and make it compulsory. So those are the things that I think it is already being implemented, but I think those are the things that we need to perhaps have a little bit more discourse in terms of philosophy and so forth. Yeah.
Thank you. Prof. Aishah, did you want to add something?
I think diversity cannot be avoided. There will certainly be a lot of diversity and differentiation between political thoughts and cultural imperative, and we cannot change that. I do agree as well. I think because of this, it would be very important, perhaps maybe, to incorporate those values into our educational system. You know, I used to teach law, and this aspect on human rights is very minute in the syllabus. If you do not take human rights as an elective subject, then you will not be able to really understand that. But of course, for the international convention, then you take public international law. So I believe what is more important is the understanding of it, and the diversity and the differences in terms of the value system, cultural, political diversity will always be there. It's how then we will actually accept that diversity, and to perform that and to take that across to unite, you know, those differentiation, those differences in terms of our different groups.
Thank you, Prof. Aishah. Yeah, thanks to Nas as well. I think a very enlightening question actually. I think I'll take a question from. So there's a question from Edward Mingat here in the Q&A box. So he asks, we should have dedicated teachers to focus on engaging with the students on the topic of unity and social harmony in schools. What is your view on this? So should we have a subject on national unity? Should there be a specific syllabus? And if there was attempts before, maybe the panelists can share why it wasn't as effective. Please go ahead. Prof. Aishah, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I will just mention in terms of some of the work that SUHAKAN has done. Yeah, because when you talk about social unity, the rights to respect each other, race, and so forth, I think SUHAKAN has done this. I think with this particular pendidikan hak asasi, onto the various schools in Malaysia, and it has been tested to selected school as a pilot project years back, and I think now is expanding for that particular matter. But clearly, I think it's only to a certain, still a very small component that has been adopted. On the other hand, again, it does not have to be incorporated as a single subject on a particular issue. You can also incorporate the values of those, in other words, the values of these issues on unity and social harmony in various different subjects. That is also another approach or strategy. And it will be very useful if it's actually started from at schools and later to universities and tertiary educations and so forth. So that will be, there are various approaches to do that, either as form of a separate subject, or you can actually integrate, instill those good values in different subjects. In geography, in history, of course, there's civic, right? And other subjects as well, in maths, because in my experience in teaching law, I teach company law for quite some time. The syllabus that are very familiar in the syllabus, it does not talk about business and human rights. But we know that there are certain issues in terms of business and human rights. So one strategy, of course, is perhaps maybe to incorporate the element of business and human rights in public international law when you discuss about the various conventions, which of course will include some form of unity as well, right? But at the same time, you can also incorporate that particular aspect in the commercial subjects as well, in terms of, let's say, natural justice in contracts. That will be in contract law. So there are various strategies for that. And again, I have to say, it goes back again to the political will, whether you want to proceed with that, because there are always different methods to achieve the objective. There are different pathways to achieve the objective.
Thank you, Prof. Ying, Hooi, do you want to add about something on this?
Yeah, yes. For this, I think whether we want to have only specific teachers that to teach, to focus on engaging with the students just on the topics of unity and social harmony in schools, I think these questions itself needs to be tackled in a much broader perspective. As in, I think if we start, if we look at the school level, teachers are basically reflect the student body itself, where students normally look upon the teachers, how they behave, what they teach, and then back at home, then they will be looking at their parents and things like that. So there are many factors in impacting on the delivery method itself. So I do not think we should only train specific teachers, or because this will impact. This will then go to the questions of do we want to have an integrated methods, or do we want to have a specific subject only about civic educations and things. But I would say, me personally, I would think that all the courses that when we design, there's always the learning outcomes that we want to achieve, either is at the school level or at the university level. But the teaching of the values, the beliefs and things, it is always come with different subjects, despite of, even in the science subject, we teach about ethics. So those are the values that we are talking about as well. And it's not solely only focusing on science. So I think integrated methods needs to be, as I just now mentioned, however, needs to have a relook, because what's happening now is that, for instance, in the school, they integrate the teaching of some elements of the human rights and or the civics into the courses, like in the subjects like Bahasa, English. But do these teachers come with the equipped knowledge on teaching about refugees? For instance, I've seen the terminology of refugees in the English book. But if you do not have a teacher who is equipped with that knowledge about, because different people, they have different views on looking at refugees, as now what we are experiencing, especially in the COVID-19. So I think sometimes it can be things that needs to have a relook and to see whether is that kind of approach can be effective, because it can turn to the other side if the teachers, for instance, subscribes to a different view, for instance, because he or she is an English teacher, not teachers who is trained in civic educations, or if you want to say human rights educations or moral studies or whatsoever.
Thank you. Yeah, I also feel like this question of whether unity should be included in the syllabus, I do have some mixed feelings as well, because I feel like in Malaysia, if we introduce a subject or a new curriculum, I think the question from the student side, being a student myself previously, the question that will always come to mind is, is this going to be tested in an exam? So and if it's not tested in an exam, students will probably most likely not take the subject seriously. But if it is tested in an exam, then it just becomes another exam that students need to take, and there might not be the values then might not be well understood, but rather just being taken as yet another examination paper to memorize lah, which I think happens a lot in our schools today. So
yeah,
yeah.
Iman, I just like to add to this. I recall when we actually formulate the syllabus in SUHAKAN in terms of all those human right modules, right, for the education system. There was this understanding and collaboration with the Ministry of Education at that time, in which we did thoroughly and various workshops with the Ministry of Education. Now, one of the concerns that actually derive from that would be, we have good syllabus incorporating well-researched and so forth. But what is also important, the educator, the one that's going to disseminate the information, are they well equipped in terms of disseminating the text, the knowledge in simple terms to the students? Because we know the current educators, the current teachers, they are specialized in the subject matter in which they are being trained with. So in putting them in a position where they have to come up with another scale of human rights, we need to ensure that they are given a particular, in other words, they are well equipped. Otherwise, I think it might not achieve its objective, and it's also, of course, not easy. Some of the issues that it's trying to convey in terms of human rights sometimes are quite technical. So unless and until this has been addressed to in terms of whether our teachers, our educators are well equipped in terms of the knowledge that they're going to disseminate or to convey to the student. So what I'm saying is that you can have good modules being constructed and formulated and being reviewed and tested, but that's not sufficient. You also must have good teachers, well-equipped teachers, knowledgeable teachers to deal with the issue and how they respond to the issues as well. Because when you talk about racial sentiment, for instance, how do you then come up with questions when a question is being asked into elimination or racial discrimination again? So those kind of projections, I think it's very important for the Ministry of Education to look into this matter, right? So the idea again is good, but the implementation as well must also be effective in order for the whole agenda to be leveraged at another level.
Thank you. Sorry, Dr. Ying, please go ahead.
Yeah, I would just like to add on to what you said just now, Aira, about, students will be thinking, if you add another subject, then they'll be thinking, do we need to sit for exam for that? Because after all, we are very much exam oriented, and there's many initiatives to try and do away with that. And for instance, we are now doing it for standard 1 until standard 3, where they are accessed through their continuous assessments in terms of carrying out projects. But if you recall, parents are not all the parents are happy with that methods, because they will say, how do I know whether my children are actually good, because I don't really see you putting the A or B and things like that, you know. And nowadays we can also see the report cards are trying to do away with the marks and the A and things, but more focusing on their soft skills and stuff like that. So those are the in the process, but not everybody actually accepted wholeheartedly. But the other point that I would like to raise, based on your point about students, the other side of it is about the educators themselves. I think throughout the previous engagements that I have with the Ministry of Education, when we want to introduce something new, so the resistance actually also comes from the teachers. I mean, of course, we can say we give them trainings and things, but the teachers have the workloads that we might not see. So, for instance, the administrative works and stuff like that, I think those issues have been raised during the time of Pakatan Harapan, but it has not been really tackled. How do we move forward with that? Because when we introduce something new, we need to see whether our existing structures can actually accommodate that, but we can't keep on adding something just as simple as that. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, I think this is an interesting thing that you know, we'll probably need a whole other webinar to talk about this issue of syllabus and all that. But we have 10 more minutes. There are a few more questions that I will read out. So there's another question from Facebook, follow up to the previous one, I think. So the question asks, in your opinion, is there still a narrative demonizing the other that is controlled by the government and the media? If so, what is the impact of it, and what can be done about combating such narratives? Any of our panelists, maybe Prof, you can answer this one.
Well, I have to say, when it comes to the media, right, this is very interesting, because especially in terms of the recent decision of Malaysia Kini and so forth, yeah, which extend in terms of the liability and so forth. If we would like to talk about freedom of speech, freedom of media, this is also a very interesting issue. Again, yeah, when it comes to about the narrative of the media and the government. But what is important, I think, is that you allow some space, right? You allow some space in terms of what you call unbiased, yeah, responsible reporting. That's what we want. Responsible reporting, and that's very important, because whatever that is written and been published now, I think, of course, now with the advancement of technology and social media, it can be interpreted in many ways, and sometimes people believe for that. So it must be responsible reporting. So we do need responsible media as well. When you talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom to publish and so forth, because we have provisions this under the Federal Constitution, and of course we have the Multimedia Act and so forth. It is not absolute. It comes with responsibility. Yeah, but you must not go to the extent that it is too controllable, that it makes them difficult actually to publish in terms of the real event, right? In terms of the real event. So, of course, this is something I believe SUHAKAN has always been advocate for, yeah, in terms of freedom of expression, freedom of speech, freedom of publication as well. And there are talks about setting up what you call, in other words, a commissioned, yeah, or a body in terms of educating this and so forth. So I have to say, this relationship or this particular issue will always be there. Yeah, it's not absolute. It must come also with responsibility. At the same time, I do believe as well, in terms of this development of what do you call this, SLAPP, the strategic lawsuit against public participation, especially against human rights defenders, of trying to express what they feel about certain issues, but there seems to be certain liability taken against them. So this is also a concern of that. This polemic relating to the relationship between freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of publish will always be there. But as long as I think there is some space given, there are some provisions and flexibility given in the law, I think they should be appropriate. Because we understand that right is not absolute under the federal constitution, and also I think there are several international conventions on the human rights that actually advocate on this as well. UDHR, ICCPR mentioned that in various articles for that particular matter. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Dr. Ying, do you have anything to add on this, please?
I think more or less, of course, I agree with that. It comes with responsibility as well. But the other perspective that I would like to put on is that the states also need to understand their obligation to actually protect and to the individuals and the groups against any human rights abuse in terms of, when we talk about freedom of speech and things like that. So they should know their obligation to fulfill all these means to protect our own people and to provide a space for us in order to take up more critical discourse. And in terms of media comes with more responsible reporting. I do agree. But the underlying factor is that is our space really safe for us to carry out any discussions that we would like to take?
Thank you. So we have about 5 more minutes in this webinar. So I have some, before I give my own closing remarks, I would just like to, there are just some other comments in the chat group, the chat box and the Q&A box. I think I'll just summarize all of them. There's some comments and questions on how to get youth more involved in cultivating national unity. How do we get more adults to understand human rights, and also some other questions about media freedom and all that. So I will give maybe about 2 minutes to each speaker just to conclude your thoughts for today, and if you want to also address some of the comments, and then I will close the webinar. So Prof. Aishah first, and then Dr. Ying. Please go ahead.
I do believe, as my I think regarding the comment, I think I welcome all forms of national unity programs for the youth, right? But again, because we have quite a number of programs before, having just a new program does not mean that we might solve the problem. Whatever it is, I think it must be well evaluated and analyzed, and also try to address those limitations and shortcomings that we had before. So any forms of national unity program must be evaluated and analyzed in terms of its effectiveness. My last remark relating to race relation and non-discrimination is that I think there should be some, this is a very important topic and very important area that we must be aware of relating to this particular issue. And for that particular matter, I think due to the lack of understanding in terms of some forms of concepts of racial discrimination, also I think contribute to perceptions and views. Yeah, as I said earlier in my presentation, ICERT, ICCPR, CEDAW, CRPD also contains article which gives certain treatments to certain group. So I think the fact that if we proceed with it, the convention also allow some form of flexibility and concession. And in order for us to to promote national unity and what you call social harmony. We have already what you call enough slogan in Malaysia, right? Like Rukun Negara that needs to be understood, and in terms of understanding those values. So I think this is very important for us to go forward and not just to, in other words, to blame on the incident and to blame on one particular community and so forth, but to also address and understand why it happened, how are those shortcomings and gaps being addressed to. Unless and until this being looked into, I think we're going to have a real problem again that will go throughout the years. And I believe with all the uprising of the young generation and the advancement of technology, I think we are matured enough, I think, to have these platforms for us to discuss intellectually. On behalf of the state, I also, I think in my presentation just now also allows, also I think the government should also allow the kind of flexibility for human rights defenders to advocate. In some countries, they also have implemented what you call the strategic lawsuit against public participation, where human rights defenders are being taken action for speaking up very vocally. So I do hope that there must be some room and space for this debate and polemic to be implemented so that we can totally understand what particular the issues and shortcomings are for a better Malaysia. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Ying, please go ahead.
Yes, actually, my last point is quite similar with what Prof. Aishah mentions towards the end. But before that, I would like to answer the questions posed by Frida, mentioning, if we're going to have, programs for the primary school, secondary school, tertiary, then how about the adults who are already, being molded with certain principles in life? And I think one thing that, of course, this point will open up for another different discussions. But if we look at the Malaysia education blueprint, there is a component about the lifelong learning. This is the part that I think Malaysia has not been doing too well in this, because what is the meaning of this lifelong learning? The lifelong learning, unfortunately, is taking in a shape where, maybe you go for communities and then you play chess and that kind of things, and then that's call it as a lifelong learning. But lifelong learning has a bigger definition with it that also includes everybody's in the society. So my concluding remarks will be that I think the questions about how youth can be involved in the national unities programs and things, and I must say that the national unity plan that has been launched is nothing really new about it, but I think this can be a very good concluding remark to say that safe space is really needed when we want to push for anybody to actually actively participate in the space that is being provided. I think if it comes with a lot of fears, whatever plans, and we're talking about, people very often have fears when they want to talk about issues on the constitutions, or when they want to touch about the race issues and things like that. So safe space is very, very important for that particular discourse to be able to take place.
Thank you so much. So I think we have come to the end of our webinar actually. Thank you so much again to both our esteemed panelists, Dr. Hooi, and also Professor Dr. Aishah Bidin. Also to all our attendees for spending your Friday morning here with us at Ideas. In case you want to catch this webinar again or share it with your friends, it will be available on our Facebook page, Ideas Malaysia. And before we really end, I would just like to again reiterate that this webinar is just one small part of our larger national unity and interracial harmony public campaign. We have 3 more actually upcoming webinars. Actually, we hope they can be public forums. If we can start organizing physical events, we will invite more speakers, we will have more attendees, and all of us here understand fully that Malaysia is an extremely diverse nation, not just inter-race, inter-ethnic, but also intra-ethnic, differences. And as Dr. Ying said just now, all of this must be celebrated. We have a lot more activities in the future. Our digital campaign will be launched this Sunday. So please stay tuned to that. And of course, thank you also to our supporter, the European Union, to whom without them, this whole project would not have been possible. So thank you so much once again.